Hey everyone, it's Jaclyn from Longarming by Jaclyn. Today we're going to continue our design series, quilt design series, and we're going to talk a little bit today about an upgrade that you may want to do in your own quilts or order in a quilt you're having made for you. And we're going to talk about the false back. So what is that? Let's pretend that this is your quilt top and then you have your batting. And normally you would sandwich that all together with the backing and then do the quilting through the quilt, and it's visible from the front and the back. So a false back, you're gonna put your quilt top and your batting, which is your puffy insulation, gives your quilting definition, and you're gonna do whatever heavy quilting, pretend this is the whole quilt, on here, and the back is just batting. So you would see your quilting stitches here. And then unlike a regular quilt that would already have the backing on it, you would then take whatever is your backing fabric. This is just a sample. I probably wouldn't combine those in real life. You would take your backing fabric and you add it after the quilting is done. And that's what makes it a false back. So you would take your backing fabric and apply it after the quilting. So no quilting would appear here, and you would have all your quilting on the front, on the top of the quilt. So why would you want that? So number one, maybe you're adding a textured back. A lot of the minkies have like the little dots, or you could get, they have these really cool knit fabrics that looks cable knit, and you wouldn't necessarily want the texture of the quilting colliding and detracting from the texture of your backing. And maybe you've got a big panel on the back, and the quilting on the back and the quilting on the front are not going to look correct together. Like if it's positioned correctly for one side, it's not positioned correctly. It's going to be right through somebody's face if you have a photo or something on the back. So you may not want the back quilted because of the image that it is. Another great reason to do a false back is words. So if you like to do script in your free motion quilting, or you have messages, those words are going to be correct on the front the way you quilted them, and then when you turn it over, you're going to see those words and they're going to be backwards, which may not be something that you care for. So another reason that you may want to do a false back. Okay, so we had textured backings. We had a conflicting image on the back, and that would include an after quilt. So what a lot of people do is you'll have whatever quilt you created for your top, and then they will create another quilt, a lot of times out of the scraps, and use that as the back. So you would have patchwork front and back, and they wouldn't necessarily line up with each other. So the quilting pattern that makes sense on one side might not make sense on the other side. Other reasons you may want to do a false back: if you upgrade to thread painting, or you do something like layered quilting, there's a lot of quilting, a lot of stitching, and it's gonna look good from the front, but a lot of times the back starts to get a lot of thread buildup and it's not as pretty looking at the back. So you may want to cover that where you don't see the sort of rough side of the stitches. So thread painting is like literally drawing the picture with the thread, and a lot of times you're going over and over the same area to build up the color and blend colors, and that's going to look good from the front, maybe not so much from the back. And then layered quilting is when you have your batting, you have a layer of fabric, you might do some quilting there, you put another layer of fabric, you can do more quilting, and then it's a cutaway method. You can cut away so that you're peeking through a top layer that has quilting and holes in it, sort of like a lacy effect, and then you see the underneath layer and whatever quilting you have there peeking through. So upgrades that you might think about doing to your quilt: layering, thread painting, false backs. Those are all little upgrades that you can think about incorporating and giving your quilt a really custom, really special look, rather than just sort of a run-of-the-mill quilt. Okay, so false back basically means that after the quilting is done, the back is added. And as a bonus, we're going to talk about 3 quick ways that you can go about that. So if you're doing an after quilt or you have an image on the back and you want a heavy insulated quilt, you can do basically 2 quilts. So you have your quilt back and batting, you do whatever quilting here. So if you've got a panel with a portrait or a picture, or an after quilt with its own piecing design, you do the quilting on here that makes sense on here. Then you take another piece of batting. You take your regular top quilt with whatever patchwork you wanted. You do your quilting here. So now I've got 2 half quilts, and then after those are all quilted and trimmed, you can then join the 2 together. So you see one set of quilting over here and one set of quilting over here. Now you are gonna end up with double batting there. You'll have good definition on both sides, but that's a very heavy, very thick quilt. So if that's what you want, that's a great way to incorporate a version of a false back. And then you would just bind that as normal. Sort of the normal way to do a false back is you do your quilt top on the batting, nothing on the back here, so your back of your quilting stitches would show up here. Then after this is off the machine and trimmed, you would add your backing. You do usually want to do a little bit of tacking so this doesn't sort of balloon out and flap away from the rest of the quilt. So you might do a little bit of tacking stitches here, and then bind as usual. And it's the binding that closes the front and the false back together. Then there's a method that I call the pillow flip. And I've seen this other places called the pillowcase method. So when everybody sews, that first like junior project that you do is to make a pillow. And you have your quilt top and your batting all quilted here, just batting on the back. And then you take your back and you're gonna do right sides together. So I have my pretty side, this would be quilted. My pretty side, this was just the backing. All trimmed up off the machine, your quilting is done. You would sew around the edges, leaving a little gap, and flip it inside out. If I could grab this. And then you have kind of like a normal seamed edge at the top. This would be turned in. And then your back would be on the back. And then you've got just that little opening that you flipped it through, and you could close that with hand stitching or top stitching, just like you would if you were making a little pillow where you do right sides together and flip it. And so once this is quilted, you kind of treat this as one piece of fabric, and this is your right side. And then this is your right side. So that's 3 quick and easy ways that you can do the pillow flip method, that you can do a false backing. And again, with any of those methods, I would do some tacking of some sort to attach the back to the binding, or in the case of the double quilted quilt, attaching the 2 half quilts together. And that could be as simple as hand tying, that could be as simple as popping over to your sewing machine, your domestic sewing machine, and doing a few little 1-inch tack stitches back and forth. It can be whatever you want, maybe just a big outline like a simple square, or a big simple X through the whole thing. So at the end of the day, you'll have less quilting on the back than on the front, and you'll avoid kind of a conflicting of textures.